Now, let's get to one of the questions that came up based on something that we were discussing last time, and that is the propriety of going to the Temple Mount. One of the things that we hear a lot is that we are not supposed to be going to the area, the site of the temple, because we are all Tamei Meith. We have all been at some point contaminated with contact, through contact with the dead, or just we've been at a cemetery, we've been standing over a grave somehow, and therefore we should not be going to the Temple Mount. And we saw already that this is not a completely true idea. It's not a true statement to say we're not allowed in the Temple Mount because we are contaminated from contact with the dead, because we saw, that's very clear from the Mishnah, and the Rishonim explained the Mishnah, that those who are contaminated with contact from the dead can go on the Temple Mount, and even a dead person himself can be, for whatever reason, brought into the Temple Mount area. It just has to be kept beyond a certain point on the Temple Mount, and that point is far away from where visitors go today. Further, we said that those who have what to do, even in the temple courtyard itself, may enter the temple courtyard if they have this contamination on them. Why? Because once everybody's contaminated like this, and the service has to happen, remember, every day the service has to happen, it doesn't matter if it's Yom Kippur or if it's Tuesday, then the service goes ahead. And the same thing was a situation with the Maccabees. We assume that they were all Tamei Meith when they went and did what they did. It takes some time to purify, at least 7 days, assuming someone has already left his source of impurity and he's sprinkled immediately with the water that has been mixed with the ashes of the red cow. So it takes some time. Yet the Maccabees themselves went ahead with inaugurating the temple and the temple service and building a new altar, even though they were contaminated. Oh, by the way, a contaminated person building an altar, how will the altar be purified? The altar is stuck to the ground, and therefore the altar cannot receive impurity. And its raw materials also are raw materials. Usually raw materials also are not susceptible to impurity. But there's even less of a problem. Why? If we wanted to get started with this whole process, with the reinitiation of the temple service, really purification isn't some magical, some magical process with which we are now unfamiliar, or something like they say, the unbroken chain of rabbinic ordination. There's no one who's been rabbinically ordained properly, at least according to the way the halacha is defined. So how are we ever supposed to start this again? So the Rav has a nice shiur explaining that is why Maimonides had to say that there is a way to restart this chain. It has to start at some point. So you have a convocation, everybody gets together, all the sages, and they decide that someone is ordained as, he is ordained by Am Yisrael, and he can then start giving ordination to others. And this is something that is necessary, because otherwise it would be impossible. How else would we even start this? And ordination is necessary in order to have a Sanhedrin to decide all the critical questions we see every week that need to be decided if we want to go ahead with this. Likewise, Maimonides tells us about a process whereby we can begin to purify people from contamination through the dead, even though it has been many years since anybody had the ashes of the red cow. And really, it's something that we can do. This isn't something beyond our, our capabilities, as long as we have the cow. And some people have this thing. I guess I was taught this in elementary school. This is completely incorrect, that a red cow is so rare, you have to be, it's a miracle if there ever is one. And that's not so true. Red cow, by the way, means what we call brown nowadays. It just means not a black cow or white cow. It doesn't mean that it has to be, fire truck red like this cup over here. It means, remember, in biblical and Mishnaic terms, they have a lot less colors. They didn't have Crayola back then. They didn't have all the names. They didn't have the Hebrew word katom, modern Hebrew word for orange. They didn't have the word kahol even. Even then, kahol didn't mean blue. It meant a substance that happened to have been blue. Just like tcheleth doesn't mean blue. It means a substance that has a color that you and I call blue. They didn't use colors. Back then, it was just everything was either red or green. They say adom or yarok. And adom refers to everything you and I see on the color wheel, from orange to purple, and also browns. And yarok covers everything from yellow to blue. And when you want to be more specific, you say yarok like the sky, means blue. And you say yarok like this, that's what they would call yellow. Nowadays they call it zahov, based from the word gold. Zahav and Zahov are related, like Za'aka on Se'aka. And when you want to say green, like Rashi says, Yaro Kikarte. Why does he mention green like a leek? Because that's a green color of that vegetable. If you didn't say that, then it's a little bit ambiguous. Okay, so this red cow is not such a fantastic thing. It's not the stuff of legend. It's not the stuff of miracles. It just so happens they did it infrequently because the halacha says that it takes just a little bit of ashes. You could put ashes into a barrel of water, and if you put the ashes into a big enough barrel of water, you will have enough water to last a long time. And if you look in the history of the red cows, you see that the first red cow, they say, Moses' red cow ashes lasted until the end of First Temple times, and according to some, may have persisted until Second Temple times. And then the Second Temple times, we suddenly find that it becomes more and more frequent as time goes on, that they're processing more and more red cows. Now, what's going on? Does it mean that they were doing something wrong? No, it means that more people are getting interested and Jews are becoming more far-flung. What happened? First Temple times, there wasn't so much of a diaspora. Yes, there were Jews in other countries. We said Yeravim fled to Egypt. He was the only Jew who was in Egypt at the time. There was already diplomatic relations with the Egyptians. So there was, instead, what we see is that the Jews lived all around the ancient Roman world and in the Parthian Empire. And the Levites and the Kohanim in those places held on to this. So because the Jews were all over the place in much greater numbers, how many Jews lived in Rome in the first century before the destruction of the temple? Todos. How many Jews lived in Alexandria of Egypt? There are people who are estimating this, that in late Second Temple times, especially when we see that they're processing the most red cows, the Jews were already all over the place.
2 million just in Israel.
2 million just in the land of Israel, and that wasn't the majority of the Jewish population of the world. So now that you have the majority, at least before the Second Temple was built, we have a Purim time. What was the situation? Mifuzarim farad bein ha'amim. The Jewish people are dispersed, separate and dispersed among the nations. We're going to take a time out now to greet people. You are Mr. Pinto?
Yes.
Hi, nice to meet you. Everybody on Zoom is here. I didn't know you're coming. We got some quinoa and some vegetables. The usual stuff is in the fridge, in the Rami Levy bag. And there's also a box with the eggs if you want that, or you can take whatever's in the closet. No? Okay, so help yourself with some food. The kitchen's over there. And there's also hot drinks. Try us. There's all sorts of things. Michal can also show you what you need. Oh. Yeah, it's all ha'adama. Everything's ha'adama. Unless you consider the grapes, the raisins in there, the car, which it's not, then you have to say ha'etz. Okay, so this red cow idea isn't something fantastic. It's not beyond our ability. And even though there is this idea that it should only be processed by those who are ritually pure, even then there is an interesting idea described in the Mishnah that is elaborated upon by the Tosefta, and we are going to read what Rambam has to say about that. It's over here in the third parak of Parah. Something very interesting comes up. It talks about, if anybody studied this, it's good to learn with the kids how they process the red cow, because they're not going to really learn it in school, so it's good as a parent to teach them. So it says over here, this is the third parak, and it says that they were bringing the ashes into the temple courtyard so they could be processed there. I just want to make sure I have the right place. I don't want to lose it over here. Okay. This is the Mishnah we're looking at. It says that once they came to Har-Bayit, they had special children who were raised apart from the rest of society. Their mothers went there to give birth in this special place, so that these children never came in contact with the dead ever, so that they could be the ones to do this process. And also, they have the whole thing that they're riding on animals and on planks. Planks of wood don't receive tuma, correct? And animals that are alive cannot receive tuma. So everything is done in a way that makes sure there's no tuma around. It says when they came to the Temple Mount, Yardu Har-Bayit Lazaroth, they descended to the Temple Mount and the courtyards. Descending the Temple Mount? How do you descend? The sages specifically identify the place of the Temple Mount from the book of Joshua because there's a double ascent up that mountain. So what does it mean descending? Because the Mount of Olives, where they burnt the cow, is technically higher. The top of the Mount of Olives is a higher elevation than the Temple Mount. Okay? That's what it means to descent. V'tachtehen chalul. And remember, the Temple Mount, it's basically hollowed out. It's just a large building now. Mipnei kever hatom. We said this before. so that in case there's someone dead underneath the Temple Mount, it's already the tumah goes up, but stops at the opening there, and then there's another domed area that stops tumah from passing. Okay. Uvfeta Chazara, at the entrance to the courtyard, Hayamitukan Kalal Shel Chatat. That's where they had the kalal. The kalal is basically a container of the water for the chatat. And chatat, in this case, with a dot and a tet, does not refer to a sin or to a sin offering. It refers to purification from the shoresh chet tet yud, like chitui. And that's why we said a few times, sometimes a sin offering, what's called a sin offering, a chatat, is not brought for any sin.
Oh, what is
Find in Nazir and Nadarim, this concept. There's Rishonim and Amoraim. Wonder, what did the Nazir do that warrants him bringing a chatav at the end of his term of service? He brings an olah, he brings a shlamim, he brings a chatav. So what does that do? And the basic shot is he did nothing wrong, even though there are those who disagree. The mainstream opinion is he did nothing wrong. It's just he's now being reduced from a level of holiness. His holiness is coming out, so he has to take a chatav. It's sort of it's a scouring process. It's like a koshering process. We take a male of the ewes. In this case, it means a very young lamb. Okay. And the koshrim chevel ben karnav. Sorry, doesn't mean young enough, but he still has horns. Okay. That way he could be scared. He has horns, and they tie this, I guess, rope or strap between his horns. The koshrin makel mesubach rosho shel chevel. And then they take a makel mesubach. What's a makel mesubach? It's I don't know. You ever prune a tree? You prune certain branches from certain trees. They have many sub branches, and they have leaves on them. So you could take, I don't know. I have to prune trees all the time. You take off this branch, and suddenly you drag it behind you in the street. It's misubach. It has a lot of other branches, and it has, if it's fresh, it still has its leaves on it, and it drags things along. A lot of things get caught in this branch. So that's what they basically tied between the horns of this lamb. They have something tied over here, and then there's a branch stuck over here, such that now he has a gigantic horn. This lamb, if it were to move forward, would poke things, it would get things stuck there. Look what they do with this. And it says here, V'zorko letocha kalal. And then they throw this makel into the kalal, umakel hazachar. And they give this zachar, this male animal, a whack. Okay? And it jumps backwards. First, he's basically leaning forward, and this stick is basically pointing into the ashes of the paraduma, and he doesn't know he's to remember. Lambs are kind of gentle. Then you give it a whack, he jumps backwards near Tala Harav, and this causes the ashes to get stuck in the branch, because the branch is basically like a broom, and it lifts up the ashes. Vinotel umekadesh, and then the child who's waiting there takes from those ashes and puts it into the water. Now, why can't the child just put his hand into the vessel which has the ashes and just or sprinkle the vessel? Because the child might be tamei anyways, and him touching the vessel will contaminate the ashes. That's how much they were I guess makpidim. They had a hakpada not to do this. That's their chumrah. Hidei sheirei al padei hamayim. And then, of course, why did he put the ashes into the water? Because that's the act of creating the paraduma water. The ashes have to be visible on the surface of the water. The ratios don't matter, like we said. It could be just a little bit of ashes, as long as they're visible on the surface of the water, and this could be a whole barrel of water. Now, Rabbi Yossi says, Al titnu makom laminim lirdot. Please do not give any room for these heretics, let's say the Karaites, to rule over us. Redu, dominate. Ella hu notel makadesh. The guy who does it, the child, just takes the ashes and sprinkles them onto the water. Why do we have to do this whole thing with the lamb and tying the rope between it and make sure you don't come in contact and just do this strange way? They also talk about using a stick, knocking off the table with the stick. Okay, so what's going on here? And we'll see here the Tosefta. The Tosefta says something very similar, and it sheds light on why it is they even had this whole thing. If Rabbi Yossi basically makes sense, where have you seen this elsewhere in the Torah or in the Mishnah? That you would have this case where you have to do so much. We just do what we're supposed to do. Why are we even doing this weird thing? It looks kind of weird. He has a good kasha. It's as though we're worried about, we're gonna let the Sadducees make fun of us. That we don't have the Torah demand such a thing, such a weird way. It doesn't say in the Torah to do this, by the way. It says that He just puts the ashes in the water, and that's how you create the paraduma water. It says nothing about this lamb and tying the ropes and everything, and the children. So we're going to see this. Hold on. Someone played with my stuff over here. I want to show it over here. One second. Someone coming in. Okay. It's right over here. Okay. It says that they would come to the Shar Yotzei Me'ezrat Nashim L'chil, and they continued over here. And then it says over here, Vafra Nishbach Noto Mekadosh Mizen Nishbach. He gives this, it explains in different words about also scaring the lamb and causing the ashes to get spilled. And then he takes it out. Once the ashes have been spilled out of the container, does the child pick it up and then put it into the water? Fine, because you can't contaminate ashes necessarily by direct contact. If they're in a container that you contaminate, so then they become contaminated. Interesting. And then he would pour it in. Ma'asim elu asu kisha'alu min hagula divrei Rabbi Yehuda. What does this mean? This is what they did when they came back from the exile. That is, early Second Temple times. They wanted to start having paraduma water. How are they going to do this? You have to be pure, like the Rambam says. You have to be pure in order to be able to purify someone else. So how do they even get the whole process started? So this is part of the way they did it. If you really lack anybody who's tamei, so here's the process, and they actually did in history. That's what Rabbi Yehuda says. Well, what's the question? No, okay. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Afaran Yarda Imahem Levavel. No, they took some of the ashes of the paraduma with them to Babylonia, sorry. The Allah, and it came with them. So the sages respond to him, Amrulo Valo Nitma Ba'aretz Ha'amim. You take this paraduma ashes or water, doesn't become contaminated by being in the land of the nations. Chutz La'aretz contaminates automatically. Amru lahem, so he responded, Lo gazru tu meretz amim ela achar shalu min hagolah. This rabbinic enactment that the foreign countries are impure is an enactment only from the times of when? Once they came back from the exile. It's a Second Temple era enactment. So they still had it back then. First Temple, in the Intertemple period, you used to be able to not get contaminated just by going to Chutz La'aretz. It hadn't been decreed yet. Okay, so now we see this. Basically, this is something that we should be doing, by the way. It's not impossible. Like anything else, there is a system that's already in play that has been described and allows us to start this all again. So yes, we might be Tmeim. We already know if we're Tmeim, we're allowed to go ahead with it. And if you're going to say, well, we've just been pushing this off, then we should have a red cow already. If you're wondering about where you're going to get a red cow, there are people here who farm red cows. The difficulty in obtaining a red cow is first making sure it's born without any white hairs or black hairs or whatever it is, and then making sure that it develops no blemish or that it's not used for anything. So then they do malacha with it, and it's like a list exact what you have to make sure that nothing happens to this cow. It has to be female, by the way. Then you go ahead with it. And these things have existed. There are red cows. And eventually, by the way, I don't know how long. If you don't milk a cow, you don't slaughter it. How long does a cow even live? What's its lifespan? No, it doesn't live. It doesn't live decades. Okay, they've had red cows, and the only reason they haven't done this is because no one's taking the initiative. Nowadays, people are taking the initiative. There are people that are there, met them. They say they're confident. If we could, we would have the temple. We would go ahead and do what we do. We're already ready for everything. This is something for which they're ready, and this is something that they could do. My question is, who's going to be the one to do it? But you see, there is a method for doing this. And by the way, it's in the temple. So if you want to get started, where does it say they did this, by the way? They didn't wait until they had got, according to Rabbi Yehuda, they didn't wait to process the ashes of the red cow before going back to the temple. They did it at the temple where they're supposed to. That is, they purify themselves when they're already in the temple. They don't say, first we'll process the ashes of the red cow, and then we'll go to the temple. They're already at the temple when they did it. And that seems to be what the Maccabees themselves also did. How did they have any of the kalim? We saw the kalim can be purified. While they're doing the service of the kalim, they purified also a menorah, a golden menorah, let's say, which they did not have. The Hanukkah miracle happened on spears. Okay, a makeshift menorah made out of spears. Let's say they contaminated the menorah. We saw you could still use it if if all the kalim are contaminated, go ahead with the service. But using contaminated menorah, so you sprinkle it on day 3 and on day 7. That's how you repurify it. But it doesn't say that the entire time it's going through purification, it's disqualified. As long as the entire service is being conducted, betuma, So you do it bituma. That's what it says. We should see what Rambam says over here. This is important because Rambam says this. He says over here, this is as far as Perush, there's a part that's missing. This is the traditional Perush, it's not the Rav Kapach edition. Rav Kapach has more, it continues past this point. It says here, he says here, I say that. Rambam quotes himself. You don't see it, it's only on the screen over here. We could do all this if we have people who are not contaminated at all. And if they were contaminated, we should keep them away from all this stuff. And it says, and they should be with kalim that cannot receive tuma. Some kalim don't receive tuma, and you should sprinkle it on. It should be sprinkled on the kohen who's going to be performing this. Hold on a second. You can say here. I want to get to the part where he's mentioning this. Here he says here, he mentions the sefta. Okay, shonat sefta. Masim elu asu kishalu b'nei gola. This is what they did when they left the exile. Why did they have to do this? They didn't have anybody who was tahor. Okay, this happened once in history. This happened twice. This is the situation nowadays. Okay, Rabbi Shimon Omer afaram yaradi mahem v'Allah. Okay, and Rabbi Shimon says that no, they had some paraduma water. Yirtzel Umar shehem ayu turim mituat made v'lo nedar mehem ish tahor. The fisha kol modim shelo gazru. Okay, he says like it says there. I wish I had the Rav Kapach one because he says it slightly differently. You know what? We don't have it here. I left it home and we don't have it on the computer. Even though Rav Kapach's edition of the Mor Nevuchim is available online, completely online, which is great. But his Perush HaMishnayos is not yet available online, so that's a problem. There's another point he says it's similar to our situation today. You have this that there's going to be a problem that even today we'll have it. You'll see over here at the beginning of the Rambam, he says, Halachic Rabbi Yossi, by the way. We hold like Rabbi Yossi. So he is like Rabbi Yossi, who says you don't have to do all this. So why was it mentioned? Why does the Mishnah mention it? Because like the Tosefta says, once upon a time they might have done it. Like Rabbi Yehuda says that. When we hold like Rabbi Yossi means it doesn't always have to be this way. Rabbi Yossi is saying you don't have to do this the way the Mishnah describes it. Why is Allah like Rabbi Yossi? The way the Mishnah describes it's like that was what they did every single time. But it turns out you don't need to do that. Really, the intention is, as I'm going to tell you now. Really, it takes a person day 3 and day 7. He has to be sprinkled on day 3 and day 7, then he can be purified. And then he goes to the mikvah at the end of that. I think it should be Yadanu. There's a mistake over here. If we knew that there's no one who's actually pure, aval kulan tamein tumat mate, but everybody's tamei mate. What does he say? Kemo bizmanenu zeh, just like today. Okay, how are we going to find a kohen who could even burn the red cow? Okay, okay, there's no one else who could do this also. So the Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi might be correct according to the Rambam, but sometimes you'll have a situation like today where you'll have to do this. That is, there is no halachic impediment nowadays, and this is something that we have to stress. You can come up with all sorts of questions and say, you know what, we don't know what to do. Teku, don't do anything. Shev al tasa. That is, I guess, refuge of a scoundrel who doesn't want to go look into this. Because if you really look into all these questions, there's nothing that's impossible. Are you allowed to go on Har-Bayis? The answer is actually yes. Can you process a paraduma and purify yourselves? The answer is yes. Are you allowed to bring korbanos in a state like even if we don't purify them ourselves? What have we seen many times? The answer is yes. You have a question of the identity of the ingredients of the Torahs, like so that's critical, right? Or knowing what the Ark of Man is. Who decides these things? How do we decide any of the critical questions that we've seen up until this point that actually stop us from doing anything? What's the answer? What the Sanhedrin decides, Rambam said, the Sanhedrin decides that is Torah Sheba'al Peh, and that's the decision. That becomes the Mitzias. Rav Kapach stresses that, for example, you have the decision of the High Court regarding when the months begin or when the leap year. Like, for example, if for whatever reason they did like they're not supposed to do, well, I mean, they're supposed to declare there's going to be a leap year, a second Adar already in Tishrei. They notify everybody it's going to be an Adar Sheni this coming year. But they can make that decision even as late as Shavat and Adar itself. They're not supposed to wait until Adar, but they can. And it points out that that actually matters for birthdays. Children are born. Children come of age with regards to actually a few halachot based on their actual Hebrew birthday, according to Hebrew calendar. What's the nafkamina? Age 3 with girls and age 9 with boys. That's technical sexual maturity. Doesn't mean puberty. It means they're capable of an act of bia. That's a halachic nafkamina. And then there's bar mitzvah, of course. Whether or not someone's obligated in the commandments depends on 12 years or 13 years for males and females. And then there's arachim. The age of 20 also matters. A person's erech depends on his birthday. And all these are mitzias. Rav Kabach points out that Chazal say that if the Sanhedrin decides that there's a new month, that pushes off the child's birthday. Okay? And especially those born in, Nisan or Adar Sheni, etc. It suddenly adds a month to the year. And for example, whether I don't like talking about these things because it makes people uncomfortable about it, but he says explicitly, if there was an act of bia for a child younger than 3, then there's still basulim. Because younger than 3, it's not considered an act. I'm going to use very yeshivish terms. And if the Beis Din Paskin say, this is we're adding another month, so that extends the year, the time. If the act happened when they thought it was Nisan, really it's Adar Sheni, so it's not an act on a 3-year-old, it's an act on a 2-year-old shy 1 month. The Mitzias Paskins that the Basulim return. Why? Because the Beis Din Paskins when the year begins and when the year ends and what a year is. The Mitzias follows the decision of the High Court. Now, there's a longer sugya. We can look in this. Rav Kapach points out he's not the first one to point this fact out. So whatever the Sanhedrin decides, that is the issue. The Rambam here is basically describing what we've seen before. There is no impediment. We can have smicha if we wanted to. We can have the Beis Hamikdash if we wanted to. Really, we're supposed to do these things. These are the commandments. And there is a halachic way. Someone said, I don't like this. Someone says if there's a halachic will, there's a halachic way. And you just have to find it. I think that's wrong. That's like the Magen of Dubno's mashal for all his mashals. The answer to the Vilna's question, where do you come up with all these good mashals? Says, I shoot the arrow into the tree and then I draw the bullseye. That's wrong. We're trying to find a way to get what we want from the halacha. That's bad. I remember there was a computer programmer fellow who was asking me, Shilo, he wanted to do something. I told him it's usher. He's trying to, what if we did it like that? Wow. He said, you know what? I'm going to do this. You try to find the halachic justification for what I'm doing. Try to find the halachic means. Why? Because when you program computers and you build applications, what you want is the goal, and you have to find the right programmers and whatever, the algorithms, anything else, the programming, the right commands to get the result you want. But whatever it is he was looking for, there is no permission for this. However, a Sanhedrin can decide. A Sanhedrin shouldn't say, our goal is to do this even though it's against the halacha. But in matters of dispute, the Sanhedrin decides the dispute, and that's the answer. It has to be. Today is either Nisan or the second day or a day in the second Adar. But the Sanhedrin has that decision. The Sanhedrin can't decide today is Iyar. It can't decide that Shvat. It decides based on 2 valid or 3 valid opinions in front of it. So with all these questions, we're not so worried. You see here, this is a precedent. The whole idea of Tumat Mate is, for those who are saying it's the biggest critical problem, it's the greatest impediment, it's blocking us from doing what we have to do. It's not true. We've already been through this before. As a matter of fact, Hanukkah teaches us that all these difficulties that prevent us from having a temple service are not insurmountable. On the contrary, if you put your faith in God, they are completely surmountable. You could win. You could even get more than you were asking for.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.